Hello, my name is Tatyana Studivant, and I will be presenting my capstone's topic on Black women's experiences with police use of excessive force and racial profiling. For my abstract, I will be discussing how Black women's experiences are understudied, the focus of the paper, and I'll identify my keywords. Police use of excessive force and racial profiling are actions by law enforcement that threaten the United States Constitution and police relationships with marginalized communities. Black women's experiences with police use of excessive force and racial profiling are not as documented or studied as compared to those of men of color. The paper will focus on the understudied population, being Black women, who are at an even more vulnerable status in terms of hostile experiences with the police force by focusing on Black women's experiences. The research questions how experiences of racial profiling and police use of excessive force differ between Black women and their counterparts, and why existing data systems fail to capture police violence experienced by Black women adequately. Intersectional analysis serves as the theoretical framework to import archival data from non-governmental organizations, reports, and surveys. The existing laws in place are not enough protection for Black women against police violence. Strengthened data systems, expanded methodological tools, fostered community partnerships, and integrated intersectional frameworks are proposed as recommendations to improve laws and outcomes. And the key words that I identified in my paper are police use of excessive force, racial profiling, Black women, and injustice. For my introduction, I will focus on police use of excessive force and racial profiling and how that is a United States crisis, how the death of George Floyd impacted the country, how the gaps in the research will be addressed, why is B capitalized in Black, and my positionality on this topic. Police use of excessive force and racial profiling are deeply interconnected problems in the United States. Excessive force refers to actions beyond what a reasonable officer would use in similar circumstances, while racial profiling, defined as suspicion based on race or ethnicity, funnels Black and Latino individuals into more police encounters, increasing the likelihood that force will be used. For decades, minorities have been disproportionately stopped, searched, detained, and subjected to violence, producing long-term psychological and social harm, including chronic stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a weakened sense of safety. Large-scale research underscores the magnitude of this crisis. A 2021 study published by The Lancet, which is a medical journal, analyzed police killings from 1980 to 2019 across multiple databases. It found that more than 30,800 people were killed by police during that period, which is over 17,000 more deaths than were captured in official United States records. Mortality rates were highest for non-Hispanic Black individuals, and overall police-related deaths increased by more than 38% across the 4 decades. These underreportings highlight both the scale of excessive force and the failures of existing data systems to collect the data appropriately. The death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, became one of the most defining and devastating moments in the national reckoning with police brutality and racial injustice. Floyd, an unarmed and handcuffed Black man, was pinned to the ground by white police officer Derek Chauvin, who pressed his knee into Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, as Floyd repeatedly pleaded that he could not breathe and cried out for his mother. An image that deeply affected millions who later watched the footage on TV. Despite being compliant, immobilized, and fully subdued, Floyd continued to endure pressure on his neck while surrounded by officers who ignored both his weakening voice and bystanders' desperate pleas for compassion. His death resonated so profoundly not only because of the excessive force used, but because it revealed the humanity of the man beneath that force. He was someone's son, father, and friend, whose final pleas for life sparked global outrage and forced a confrontation with the human cost of unchecked police authority. Much of the scholarship and public attention disproportionately centers on men of color, particularly black men, because of their long-standing criminalization in American society. As a result, the experiences of black women remain significantly under-examined. Cultural assumptions and stereotypes make black women less likely to be perceived as actual victims of police violence. These assumptions stem from limited exposure, biased media portrayals, and deeply rooted social norms, obscuring the unique intersectional forms of harm Black women face. This paper seeks to address that gap by examining how police racial profiling and use of force affect Black women differently from Black men, and why national data systems routinely fail to capture our experiences. Black women face distinct forms of surveillance, coercion, and physical or psychological force shaped by the intersection of race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Yet, misclassification and underreporting render our experiences statistically invisible. By using archival research and intersectional analysis, this work aims to broaden the understanding of police violence and develop policy recommendations that protect those most overlooked. I capitalize the term Black when referring to Black women in the Black community to honor my identity and positionality as a Black woman. This practice acknowledges the erased history of the African diaspora dating back to the transatlantic slave trade. The Associated Press, also known as the AP style book, is the guide for most United States news organizations. Historically, the AP style book required quote unquote black to be lowercase as a racial descriptor, but it now mandates capitalization when referring to people reflecting shared history, culture, and identity. Using a capital B distinguishes the racial and cultural identity from the color itself and aligns with the respect and recognition afforded to other ethnic groups. For me, this topic is personal. As a Black woman, my identity shapes both how I navigate society and how I understand policing in America. The decision to capitalize Black reflects a recognition of shared cultural identity and historical erasure. Like many Black women, I have experienced microaggressions, discrimination, and the constant fear attached to something as routine as driving. Each time I'm on the road, I am aware that a traffic stop carries a possibility far greater than a citation, the possibility that I may not make it home. This fear is not hypothetical. It is rooted in generations of police violence against Black women. My experiences give me both the urgency and the responsibility to highlight Black women's stories in discussions of excessive force and racial profiling, ensuring that our narratives are no longer overlooked. On this slide, I will be just identifying my research question, which is how do experiences of racial profiling and police use of excessive force differ between Black women and their male counterparts? And why do existing data systems fail to capture police violence experienced by Black women adequately? The methods used are intersectionality, critical junctures, and process tracing, and police public interactions. To answer my research question, the research uses an intersectional framework, which was first articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, which examines how race, gender, class, and other identities intersect to shape experiences within systems of power. In an interview, Crenshaw stated that intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides and where it interlocks and intersects. Intersectionality, intersectionality is essential because Black women's policing experiences cannot be fully understood through race or gender alone. Intersectionality guides both data collection and analysis, ensuring sampling reflects intersecting identities and allowing the study to highlight how gendered racial stereotypes, like assumptions about aggression or credibility, affect outcomes differently for Black women versus men. Data from non-governmental associate organizations like the Center for Policing Equity, also known as the CPE, strengthens understanding of police violence and supports evidence-based reforms through research, community engagement, and policy innovation. I will discuss the CPE a little later. The study also integrates critical junctures and process tracing. Critical junctures are key historical moments when institutional decisions set long-term trajectories, often excluding marginalized communities. Process tracing reconstructs sequences of events to reveal how these early decisions shaped contemporary patterns in policing, data collection, and disparities in law enforcement outcomes. Together, these methods often identify how laws, reporting rules, and policies produce differential experiences for Black women. Finally, this study examines police public interactions using the 2020 Policy Public Contact Survey data. These years captured in the report are 2015, 2018, and the early months of 2020. These years are significant because in 2015, many high profile deaths of Black civilians occurred, and 2020 was a period of partial reform and policy stabilization, and COVID-19 and racial justice uprising shaped 2020. Analyzing this period reveals how racial disparities in policing evolved during moments of accountability, reform, and social upheaval, highlighting the gaps in reporting and understanding the policing experiences of Black women. And I will also be discussing further about the policy public contact survey as well. Key terms. I will be discussing the definitions for use of force, excessive force, because they are two different things, and racial profiling. Police have the authority to use force against individuals to protect themselves or others, but the concept of excessive force lacks a universally accepted definition. The Internal Association of Chiefs of Police defines use of force as the amount of effort required by police to compel compliance by an unwilling subject. This can include verbal orders, physical restraints, and even deadly force. However, police use of excessive force is defined as the use of more force than a reasonable police officer would have used in the same set of circumstances to achieve a legitimate goal. Excessive force also represents a serious potential violation of citizens' constitutional rights, which will be discussed during the analysis. Determining what constitutes as quote unquote justifiable use of force remains highly problematic. Even though law enforcement officers are trained to assess situations in which action may be necessary to protect themselves or others, the discretion required in these decisions highlights the ongoing tension between maintaining public safety and safeguarding individual rights. Racial profiling is when law enforcement targets people for potential crime based on their race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Police also use criminal profiling, which relies on characteristics they believe are linked to crime. Examples of racial profiling include stopping drivers for minor traffic violations because of their race, which is often called driving while black or brown, or searching pedestrians for illegal items based on their race. High numbers of incarcerations of Black and Brown citizens are a result of racial profiling. Blacks, Latinos, and other racial minorities are disproportionately impacted by the discriminatory behavior, which has been extensively documented throughout the United States. The literature review. For the literature review, I will be covering court decisions that reveal that rulings are favored toward the police, quantitative and qualitative research that highlight racial disparities, psychological and sociological research, and I will also talk about a book by Andrea Ritchie. Research on police use of excess of for Research on police use of force and racial profiling reveals a complex interplay between legal frameworks, community perceptions, and long-standing racial inequities. Court decisions play a central role in shaping law enforcement practices, often granting broad discretion to officers while failing to distinguish between disabling and deadly force. Analyses of U.S. cases involving tasers, for example, show that courts overwhelmingly uphold their use against resistant individuals, even as concerns about safety and potential harm remain unresolved. These judicial rulings influence departmental policies and training, effectively institutionalizing certain uses of force while not necessarily reflecting the actual risk to civilians. Legal precedences, including Tennessee versus Gardner, which restricts deadly force against fleeing suspects, and Graham versus Connor, which established the objective reasonableness standard, provide a constitutional framework for policing. However, correctional environments often operate under more permissive rules, allowing the use of force in circumstances that would be impermissible in standard policing, reflecting outdated assumptions about imminent danger. Quantitative and qualitative research further highlights the racial disparities embedded in policing. Statistical studies revealed that traffic stops, arrests, and uses of force disproportionately impact Black, Latino, and other minority communities. Environmental factors such as the role of daylight in traffic stops illustrate that racial bias persists even under seemingly neutral circumstances. Qualitative research complements these findings by capturing the lived experiences of those affected by policing. Interviews demonstrate that encounters with racial profiling and excessive force frequently foster long-term fear, distress, and mistrust. Together, the data reinforce the idea that structural permissiveness in the courts and law enforcement policies translate into real, everyday harm for marginalized communities. Psychological research further illustrates the profound consequences of discriminatory policing. Repeated exposure to racial profiling has cumulative effects on mental health, including heightened risk for PTSD and other stress-related disorders. These impacts are compounded when police discrimination occurs following traumatic events, leading to deepening cycles of mistrust and disengagement from law enforcement. Sociological studies show that communities experiencing persistent discrimination often withdraw cooperation, which can reduce crime clearance rates and further undermine public safety. Public perception studies also reveal racial disparities. Black victims of police violence are frequently judged less favorably, creating a reasonableness gap between legal standards and public opinion. These perceptions reinforce both institutional tolerance of excessive force and the sense of injustice felt within minority communities. Policy oriented research emphasizes the need for reform to redress these systemic disparities. Scholars advocate for clearer limits on the authorized use of deadly force, enhanced accountability, procedural justice measures, and reallocation of investigative resources following incidents of excessive force. Importantly, much of the existing research has historically focused on men, leaving a critical gap in understanding the experiences of Black women. Andrea Ritchie's book, Invincible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, offers a critical extension of this literature by foregrounding the experiences of women of color who remain strikingly absent from most empirical studies. Ritchie's work identifies historical and systemic patterns that complicate existing models of police violence, including intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and ability. While her analysis connects strongly to themes of structural discrimination and community mistrust found across the literature, it also exposes a major gap, which is the gap that I have been talking about, and that is most research focuses on men. This gap limits understanding of how gendered and intersectional identities shape police encounters. For example, Black women experience unique forms of discrimination, including hypersexualization and credibility dismissal, patterns that cannot be fully understood through male-centered research. Collectively, the literature demonstrates that racial profiling and police use of excessive force are embedded in legal, psychological, and socio-political systems. Court rulings, statistical analyses, personal narratives, and psychological studies all reveal persistent disparities, trauma, and mistrust. Intersectional research, particularly that focuses on Black women, fills critical gaps in our understanding, showing that race, gender, and other identities intersect to shape policing outcomes. These findings underscore the urgent need for comprehensive, evidence-based, and intersectional reforms to create a more equitable and accountable system of policing in the United States. On this page, I will be talking about part of my analysis, which is the violation of citizens' constitutional rights, federal investigations, and how they show high numbers of Black women's experiences of sexual assault and harassment by police, and the death of Sandra Bland. Police use of excessive force and racial profiling directly violate core constitutional protections, especially those in the Fourth and 14th Amendments, which safeguard people from unreasonable searches and seizures and guarantee equal protection under the law. The Equal Protection Clause is a key legal basis for challenging racially discriminatory policing practices and allows lawmakers and courts to object to bias enforcement even when individual officers' motives are difficult to prove. Existing criminal statutes also authorize the prosecution of law enforcement misconduct, meaning constitutional and statutory tools already exist to hold officers and agencies accountable for rights violations. Black women experience police violence in ways that are distinct from both Black men and white women because racism and sexism intersect to shape how we are perceived and treated. Intersectionality explains that race and gender cannot be separated in these encounters. Instead, overlapping systems of oppression create unique patterns of harm, invisibility, and resilience for Black women. Legal categories that isolate racism from sexism often fail to capture these realities, leaving Black women's experiences under-recognized and underprotected in law and policy. Research and federal investigations show that Black women are disproportionately exposed to sexual harassment and assault by police, particularly in situations like traffic stops, custodial settings, and street level encounters where officers hold significant power. Survival strategies used by Black women, such as self defense against abusive partners or navigating poverty and homelessness, are frequently criminalized, resulting in punishment rather than protection. Black women who organize or protect or protest against racial injustice also face heightened surveillance, force, and retaliatory arrest, revealing how state power is used to control our political participation. Sandra Bland's arrest in July 2015 and her death became a pivotal moment for the Black Lives Matter movement, spotlighting racialized policing and Black women's vulnerability to police violence. Sandra Bland was a Black woman and social activist. She was pulled over for a traffic stop by white state trooper Brian Anencia, and the stop escalated when she questioned why he ordered her to put out her cigarette. He then tried to force her from the car and drew his taser. When she complied and stepped out of the car, she was led out of view of the camera, where the trooper forced her to the ground, handcuffed her, and arrested her on a felony assault charge. The charge was because the officer claimed she kicked him during the struggle. During processing, Bland reported a prior suicide attempt, but was not placed on suicide watch. She was held alone in a cell and repeatedly called her family members for help securing her release. 3 days later, officials reported she had died in her cell from suffocation with a plastic bag, ruling it a suicide, a finding her family immediately disputed while demanding an independent investigation. Her case shows how routine stops can intensify when Black women assert their rights, how racialized and gendered stereotypes can invite harsher force, and how weak mental health protections and custodial neglect fuel deep mistrust of carceral institutions. The analysis here will be continued, and I will be discussing non-governmental reports and surveys and the Violence Against Women Act, also known as VAWA. The Center for Policing Equity's 2024 annual report documents large-scale efforts to measure and reduce racial bias in policing, including partnerships with dozens of departments, new data tools, and multiple research publications. The organizations produced 7 major research publications, data briefs, and papers during the year, and launched new initiatives such as the Racial Justice Act data tool in California to support public defenders in identifying racial disparities in criminal cases. Their work also emphasizes the importance of shifting from punitive policing models toward community driven preventative safety systems, particularly in Black and marginalized communities. And this reinforces their 3 strategic pillars, which are making the problem measurable, making the solutions relu- making the solutions rooted in partnership, and making the problem solvable. The report also demonstrates critical findings around persistent gaps in police accountability and data transparency. For example, a peer-reviewed study published by the CPE found that of 940 in custody deaths following non-firearm police force, which was between the years 2012 and 2021, only 28.5% were classified as homicides, and 42.6% of cause of death reports mentioned force, indicating major inconsistencies in how deaths after police restraint are recorded. Additionally, the CPE's community-based work revealed that many public safety redesign efforts are more effective when communities lead design and implementation rather than being passive recipients of reform. The report concludes that while data and science are vital, profound change will require shifting power and resources towards communities most impacted by policing, thus emphasizing both measurable reform metrics and redistribution of authority in the public safety ecosystem. The CPE's 2024 annual report captures vital data on the Black community's experience with police use of excessive force and racial profiling, but it neglects to represent specific groups within the community. Everyone's experiences within the community are not the same. To fully comprehend the impact of police violence and racial bias within a marginalized group, data specific to gendered experiences will provide a closer lens into the phenomenon. According to the 2020 Police Public Contact Survey by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, women are increasingly experiencing threats or the use of force during encounters with law enforcement. The numbers are prominent. Women now account for 31% of all individuals who report being threatened with or subjected to physical force by police. Even more alarming is that more than half of these women, being 51%, say that the force used in their most recent encounter was excessive. That's an 8% point increase from 2018, signaling a troubling rise in police violence directed at women. Despite these concerning trends, the data we have still tells only part of the story. The Police Public Contact Survey and similar databases do not break down police interactions by both sex and race, which means that unique experiences of Black women remain largely hidden in national reporting. We also lack meaningful insight into how police counters changed during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Violence Against Women Act, also known as VAWA, has played a major role in expanding services and legal protections for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, including new safeguards for Native American and LGBT communities. VAWA represents a federal statutory framework aimed at enhancing the criminal justice system's response to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, while simultaneously expanding access to critical services for victims and survivors. Originally enacted in 1994 with sponsorship by then Senator Joseph Biden, it was subsequently reauthorized in 2000, 2005, and 2013. The legislation has evolved to become increasingly robust and inclusive. The 2013 authorization not only renewed essential grant programs established under the original statute, but also introduced new initiatives designed to address emerging gaps in protection and service provision. At the same time, its early emphasis on mandatory and pro arrest policies encouraged more aggressive policing responses to domestic violence, embedding a carceral approach into national policy. These strategies were promoted as deterrents, but did not fully account for how increased police involvement might endanger women in heavily policed communities, especially Black women. For Black women and girls, VAWA's pro arrest framework has often translated into greater exposure to harmful police interventions during domestic violence calls. Mandatory and pro arrest statutes have contributed to dual arrest and misidentification of survivors as primary aggressors, outcomes shaped by long-standing stereotypes that cast Black women as angry, aggressive, or less deserving of protection. Campaigns such as hashtag Say Her Name document cases where police killed Black women during domestic violence responses, illustrating how policies meant to protect survivors can, without an intersectional lens, intensify criminalization and lethal force instead. Together, these patterns underscores that police violence against Black women is not an exception, but a systemic result of overlapping racial, gender, and legal hierarchies. Intersectional analysis reveals how constitutional rights, data practices, criminal justice reforms, and statutes like VAWA can both extend protections and unintentionally increase vulnerability for Black women. Centering their experiences, centering our experiences is therefore essential for designing safety strategies that reduce harm, enhance accountability, and move beyond narrow punitive models of policing. The recommendations. Here are some of my recommendations. Randomization, inclusion of negative case analysis, and updating policing databases. A major weakness in current research is selection bias. Because many studies rely heavily on data from Black men or other male groups, while including very few minority women. When study participants do not represent the broader population, findings can be skewed and fail to describe the true scope of policing harms. This bias often arises from non random recruitment methods or structural factors that shape who is reachable and willing to participate. Randomization is a key strategy for reducing selection bias and improving internal validity. By randomly assigning participants or units to groups, researchers create comparable groups that face the same potential risk and conditions. So differences in outcomes are more likely due to the intervention rather than who was selected. Without randomization, studies on policing may exclude large segments of affected communities and unintentionally reinforce existing biases. Another weakness is the lack of negative case analysis, where researchers deliberately seek out data that challenge dominant patterns or theories. Few studies examine law enforcement perspectives, contested incidences, or cases that disrupt assumptions about reasonable suspicion, crime statistics, or typical profiles of victims and offenders. Including negative cases can surface contradictions, deepen explanations of why excessive force and profiling occur, and strengthen the credibility of findings. Current policing databases also fall short because they rarely disaggregate data by both race and gender, making Black women statistically invincible. National instruments like the Police Public Contact Survey discussed before usually report broad categories and focus on fatal encounters, leaving out everyday harms such as harassment, coercion, invasive searches, and threats involving family members. Federally mandated race gender disaggregated data on all types of encounters is essential to reveal the full spectrum of state violence against Black women. My recommendations, more of my recommendations. New data collection tools are needed to improve research, community-based participatory research, and adoption of intersectional frameworks, and improving transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies. Improving research requires new tools specifically designed to capture gender dimensions of police contact. Trauma-informed surveys, interview protocols, and standardized reporting systems for sexual misconduct and coercive threats can generate more accurate and detailed information about Black women's experiences over time. Longitudinal studies are especially important for tracking how repeated police contact affect Black women's mental health, economic security, and family stability across their lives. Community based participatory research, the CBPR, offers a powerful way to fill these empirical gaps. Partnering with Black women's organizations and community groups helps ensure ethical practices, uncovers patterns of misconduct that official records omit, and amplifies voices that institutions often ignore. These collaborations are particularly vital for documenting sensitive harms that like sexual violence, retaliation, and coercive control by police. Adopting explicitly intersectional frameworks is also crucial for future studies. Intersectional methods recognize how race, gender, class, immigration status, sexuality, and disability combine to shape Black women's encounters with law enforcement. Using stratified samples, mixed methods, and intersectional causal models prevents research from centering only men in racial analyses or only white women in gender-based violence studies. Finally, improving transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies is essential for advancing scholarly understanding. Many police departments restrict access to misconduct records, use of force reports, and internal audits, hindering researchers' ability to examine patterns of abuse. Standardized public reporting requirements, independent auditing bodies, and open access databases of officer misconduct would facilitate more rigorous and comprehensive analysis. Collectively, these recommendations call for a transformative research agenda that centers Black women in the study of policing, strengthening data systems, diversifying methods, building community partnerships, and embedding intersectional analysis can close long-standing knowledge gaps and guide policies that genuinely address police use of excessive force and racial profiling. Such challenges are essential not only for more accurate literature, but also for designing reforms that confront the specific forms of police violence Black women endure. In conclusion, police use of excessive force and racial profiling are direct violations of citizens' rights. Further research on this topic will aid in minimizing its detrimental effects in minority communities. Multiple studies call for policy and community relations reform. These practices will ensure police are held accountable and contribute to more positive community perceptions. The absence of Black women's experiences is prevalent throughout the existing literature. Neglecting this marginalized group identifies selection bias within the research. An intersectional research design is needed with Black women's lived experiences included to comprehensively understand how multiple minority groups are affected by police use of excessive force and racial profiling. Intersectional analysis enables the research to become more specific and intentional. Here is my first slide of my bibliography, and here's my second slide of my bibliography. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.